Helena had moved to a small, isolated town, seeking a fresh start. Life in the big city had become unbearable for her, and the isolation offered a peace that seemed ideal. The town, with its old architecture and almost deserted streets, was quiet, but there was something unsettling in the atmosphere. It didn't take long for her to start hearing the rumors. While having coffee at a small local cafe, Helena overheard two elderly people talking about a mask shop. They said the shop was only seen at night, and that the masks sold there were special. According to the rumors, the masks had the power to reveal the deepest fears of whoever wore them. Some claimed that when you put on one of these masks, you were transported into a nightmare where you had to face your worst fear. If you failed to overcome it, your soul would be trapped inside the mask forever. Helena, always a skeptic when it came to superstitions, laughed quietly to herself. These must be stories made up to scare tourists, she thought. However, as the days passed, her curiosity grew. After all, she had nothing to lose, and as a new resident of the town, the idea of exploring something mysterious seemed irresistible. It was on a full moon night, while walking through the empty streets of the town, that Helena found the mask shop. It was on a corner she swore had never existed before. The shop's facade was simple, with an old, rusty sign that read, "Antiques and Masks." The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light came from inside, as if waiting for a visitor. Helena hesitated for a moment, remembering the stories she had heard, but curiosity won over. "It's just an old shop," she told herself, as she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside the shop was dense, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. On the shelves, dozens of masks of all kinds were displayed, each one stranger than the last. Some were made of leather, others carved from wood, and others seemed far too ancient to even imagine where they had come from. Behind the counter, an elderly man watched Helena closely, as if he had known she would come. "Can I help you?" he asked in a raspy, low voice that echoed off the walls of the small shop. Helena, trying to hide her discomfort, smiled and said she was just browsing. She approached a mask that seemed especially old. Its face was expressionless, almost neutral, but there was something disturbing about its empty eyes. "This one," the shopkeeper said without her needing to ask. "It reveals the fear you try hardest to hide." Helena felt a chill, but determined not to give in to fear, she picked up the mask and put it on. As soon as Helena put the mask on her face, something changed. The air around her seemed to freeze for a moment, as if time had stopped. The shop, with its shelves and dim lights, began to slowly fade from her vision, being replaced by a vast, dark emptiness. At first, Helena tried to remove the mask, but her hands wouldn't obey. A sense of paralysis took over her body, and before she could understand what was happening, she was transported to a different place. Suddenly, she found herself on an empty street. It was familiar but deserted, as if the whole world had been abandoned. The silence was oppressive, and the sky, a heavy gray, seemed to carry the weight of something she couldn't quite identify. The feeling of loneliness enveloped her completely. It was as if she were trapped in a place where no one existed, as if she were the last person on Earth. She walked down the street, searching for any sign of life. Each step echoed in the void. Helena had never considered herself a lonely person, but somehow that place revealed a deep, primal fear she barely knew existed within her. The fear of being alone, of being forgotten, of no one ever coming back. The houses she passed were empty, the windows dark and lifeless. She felt a growing despair within her. Every corner she turned, every door she tried to open, only brought her back to the same place. It was as if she were trapped in a loop, doomed to walk those deserted streets forever, never finding anyone. "This isn't real, this isn't real," she repeated to herself, trying to calm down. But the fear was too real. The sense of abandonment and isolation began to suffocate her. She felt her heart pounding, as if her own mind were trying to escape the nightmare. Amidst her anguish, Helena finally managed to tear off the mask. The sound of her own ragged breathing was the only thing that connected her back to reality. Suddenly, she was back in the shop, the shelves and masks in place, the shopkeeper silently watching her from the other side of the counter. "Did you see what lies within you?" he asked, his expression neutral. "Now your fear has been revealed, and it is trapped in that mask." Helena was still panting, trying to understand what had just happened. Whatever that nightmare was, it felt more real than any dream she had ever had. She looked at the mask she had taken off, now back on the shelf, as if she had never touched it. "What does that mean?" she asked, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. The shopkeeper gave a slight smile. "You'll find out soon. Fear doesn't go away so easily." In the days that followed her experience at the shop, Helena couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Something had changed. The shopkeeper had said her fear was now trapped in the mask, and she couldn't stop thinking about what that truly meant. That night, when she finally managed to sleep, the nightmares began. Helena found herself once again on the same deserted street from the nightmare she had lived through with the mask. This time, however, the sense of loneliness was even more intense. The shadows of the houses around her seemed to stretch and grow, as if the darkness were closing in on her. Every closed door, every dark window, represented a barrier between her and the rest of the world. No matter how much she ran or screamed for help, no one appeared. She was completely alone. She woke up gasping for air, sweat dripping down her face. The feeling of suffocation was as real as it had been in the dream. Trembling, Helena looked around her room, trying to convince herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her. "It's only a nightmare," she told herself as she took deep breaths. But as the days went by, the nightmares became more frequent and more intense. Helena started noticing subtle changes in her real life. When she walked through the streets of the town, she felt like she was being watched, but there was never anyone around. Sometimes, when she turned a corner, she felt as though the world around her was slightly different, darker, more empty. It was as if the loneliness she had faced in the nightmare was beginning to manifest in reality. One afternoon, while organizing her house, she heard a strange sound coming from the next room. It was a soft rustling, like something was moving. She went to investigate, but when she opened the door, there was nothing there. Only the silence of the house surrounded her. Still, the discomfort persisted, and a sense of emptiness grew inside her. As night approached, Helena had a sudden realization. The mask. Everything started after she put on the mask. There was something about that piece, something she couldn't explain, that was changing her perception of reality. The shopkeeper had warned her that the fear was trapped in the mask, and now she felt that fear closing in on her more and more each day. She began avoiding leaving her house at night. The streets that once seemed harmless now made her uneasy. The silence of the town, which had once brought her peace, had become heavy, almost oppressive. Helena realized that she was being consumed by fear. Every corner she passed, every shadow she saw out of the corner of her eye, made her feel completely alone in the world. The nightmares, once limited to sleep, started invading her waking moments. She saw images of the deserted street, heard voices that disappeared as soon as she tried to follow the sound, and felt the presence of loneliness creeping closer and closer each day. Helena knew she couldn't go on like this. Somehow, she had to return to the shop and confront whatever had been released. Helena couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The shop, the mask, the nightmares, everything was connected. The feeling of being watched, the visions of the empty street, and the overwhelming fear of being alone were consuming her. She knew she needed to return to that shop, confront the shopkeeper, and understand what was really happening. That night, determined to solve the mystery, Helena left her house and walked through the dark streets of the town. The dim streetlights cast long shadows on the ground, creating strange figures that seemed to follow her every step. The silence of the night was even more oppressive, and she felt the weight of being alone in a place where no one seemed to be awake. When she finally arrived at the corner where the shop had first appeared, she stopped. There was nothing there, just an empty street. For a moment, despair took over. Did I imagine everything? She thought as her heart began to race. But then, as if waiting for her approach, the shop suddenly reappeared. It was as if it had materialized from nowhere, with the same aged facade and dim light coming from within. Helena cautiously pushed open the door, and the sound of the bell echoed through the darkened shop. The shopkeeper was there, as if he hadn't moved since her last visit, watching her with his calm, unsettling gaze. "I knew you'd be back," he said, a slight smile on his face. No one escapes their own fears. Helena approached the counter, her fear and frustration building within her. "What did you do to me? What is happening?" she nearly shouted, her voice shaking. The shopkeeper observed her for a moment, as if assessing how much she already understood. "The masks are windows into our deepest fears. They don't create fear, they only reveal what's already inside you." Helena shook her head, struggling to process his words. "Then why do I keep seeing these things? Why do I feel this way?" He shrugged, his serenity unsettling. "You haven't faced your fear, so it continues to haunt you. Until you confront the loneliness you fear so much, it will continue to pursue you. And if you fail, your soul will be absorbed by the mask. It's the cycle." Helena's stomach turned as she heard this. She thought it had only been a legend, but everything was becoming painfully real. The mask hadn't just shown her fear, it had unleashed something that couldn't be controlled so easily. "So, what do I do now?" The shopkeeper extended a hand, gesturing toward a different mask on the shelf. "You have a choice. You can face your fear once more and try to defeat it. Or you can surrender to the mask. But if you choose to confront it, you must be prepared. It will be stronger this time." Helena hesitated. The thought of putting on the mask again terrified her, but she knew that if she didn't, she would be condemned to live with that fear forever, or worse, her soul would be absorbed by the mask, just as the shopkeeper had said. "I'll face it," she said firmly, though she felt the weight of her decision in her words. The shopkeeper merely nodded. "Then choose the mask." Helena took a deep breath and reached for the shelf. She picked up a different mask this time, one with dark, haunting features, but carrying the same weight as the other. She knew that by putting it on, she would face something even more terrifying than before. And this time, she couldn't afford to fail. With a trembling hand, Helena placed the mask over her face once again. Instantly, the shop vanished, and she found herself plunged into an abyss of darkness. She was back on that desolate street, but this time, everything felt far more intense and terrifying. The gray sky was darker, the silence was heavier, and the emptiness around her was vast and overwhelming. The feeling of solitude gnawed at her core, sharper and more consuming than ever before. This time, the street seemed endless, stretching out into infinity. As Helena took a step forward, she sensed an invisible force watching her, feeding on her dread. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, and though no one was there, the oppressive sense of isolation was suffocating, closing in on her like walls. "You've always been alone," a voice echoed through the darkness, cold and familiar, "and you always will be." Helena stopped in her tracks, her heart racing. The voice was quiet, yet it reverberated through her mind, as if it had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. She turned, desperately searching for the source of the voice, but saw only emptiness, a void that stretched out, reflecting her deepest fear. The urge to run gripped her, but she resisted. She knew that running wouldn't save her. This was what the shopkeeper had meant. She needed to face her fear, not flee from it. And so instead of retreating, Helena took a step forward into the silence. "I'm not alone," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "This fear doesn't control me." As she spoke, the darkness around her began to ripple, as if her words were challenging the emptiness itself. But the silence pushed back, pressing in harder, trying to suffocate her resolve. "Loneliness is your only truth," the voice whispered back, harsher and more insistent. "No one will come for you." The despair threatened to overwhelm her, but Helena held her ground. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, anchoring herself in her own strength. "Even if I am alone," she said, louder this time, "I will survive." At that moment, the shadows seemed to waver, their hold on her loosening. The cold around her began to fade, and the bleak landscape of the empty street started to dissolve. She had faced her deepest fear, acknowledged it, and in doing so, broken its power over her. When Helena opened her eyes, she was back in the shop. The dim light and dusty shelves surrounded her, and the shopkeeper stood across from her, observing with a satisfied look. "You faced it," he said quietly. "Few people succeed." Helena, exhausted and shaken, simply nodded. She felt different, lighter somehow, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She wasn't free of fear, but she was no longer its prisoner. "You are free," the shopkeeper said softly, his tone almost kind. For now. Helena removed the mask, her hand steady. She knew the fear wouldn't disappear entirely, but she'd faced it and emerged stronger. As she turned to leave the shop, she looked back one last time, but the shopkeeper and the masks were already fading into the darkness. Outside, the quiet night seemed calmer, and the burden she'd been carrying was gone. She walked down the empty streets, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known before. She was ready to move on with her life. Yet days later, Helena heard rumors from a nearby town about a strange shop filled with masks that appeared only at night. It was said the masks could show you your worst fear, and that once you put one on, the fear would never truly leave you. The cycle of fear had found its next destination, waiting for those bold enough or foolish enough to confront their deepest terrors.